Felicitous greetings, fellow fanatics. Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Fanatic, and today we're taking a look at Star Wars the card game, a dueling LCG by Fantasy Flight Games. Those of you that have been here a while may recall that my first tabletop-related video was actually an overview of this game where I fanboyed about it for a while. In that video, I vaguely suggested that I would eventually be doing a review of this one. Well, today is eventually. Designed by Eric Lang and released in 2012, in Star Wars the card game, which I'll simply be referring to as the Star Wars LCG from here on out, two players will play in a moderately asymmetrical fashion. One player will take on the role of the dark side, attempting to get the Death Star dial to 12 in order to win the game. The dial will slowly tick up at the start of each of their turns, but they can also destroy light side objectives to make it go faster. Meanwhile, the light side player will be attempting to destroy 3 dark side objectives before this happens. To set up, each player will choose a faction, bring an objective deck, a command deck, and gather 3 force commitment cards. Each of these decks will be shuffled separately, and each player will draw the top 4 cards of their objective deck. They'll place one back on the bottom of the deck and set the other 3 face down. After that, they draw from their command deck up to their reserve value, which will typically be 6. At this point, each player has the option of mulliganing their hand, taking all the cards within it and reshuffling them back into the deck to draw a new hand. They take no penalty for doing this, but may only do so once, even if their new hand is worse than the original one. Starting with the dark side, both players will reveal their starting objectives and the first round will begin. Each player's turn consists of 6 phases. First is the balance phase, which acts differently depending on which player's turn it is. For the dark side player, they will always begin by advancing the Death Star dial by 1 point. At the start of the game, the balance of the force, represented by this token, always begins with the light side. However, if the balance is with the dark side at the start of their turn, they'll advance it 1 additional tick. During the light side player's turn, if they control the balance, they can place 1 damage on any dark side objective. However, if the balance is with the dark side at the start of the light side player's turn, then nothing happens. I'll get more into how the balance of the force works once we get to the force phase. The second phase of each turn is the refresh phase. Typically, there won't be much to happen during your first refresh, but in later rounds, this will very much change. There are 3 steps you'll take during your refresh phase. First, you'll remove 1 focus token from each card that has one on them, and Vader will get to remove a second token since he is elite. After that, you remove all shields from cards you control, and replace any lost objectives so that you once again have 3. Keep in mind that the light side player skips the remove focus token step of their first refresh phase, so they can't get any freebies by playing cards during the dark side player's first turn. The third phase is the draw phase. First, the active player has the option of discarding any 1 card from their hand. Then, regardless of whether or not they discarded, they must make the number of cards in their hand match their reserve value, usually drawing up, but in rare occasions having to discard down to match it. The fourth phase is the deployment phase. Most units and enhancements can only be played during this phase. Notice that each faction and objective, and sometimes other cards, will have a resource value here, which can be used to pay the cost of playing cards. In order to get their economy rolling, the Sith player is going to pay 1 resource to play out Sith Library. They do this by placing a focus token on a card that produces resources. Sith Library is an enhancement, which means it attaches itself to something else, be it a unit, an objective, or in this case, the player's play area itself. Generally, enhancements will remain in play until whatever they're attached to is destroyed. Next, the dark side player will play Interrogation, which is an event card. Most cards will have a faction listed here. In this case, Interrogation is a Sith card, which means at least 1 of the resources used to pay for it must come from a card of the matching faction. 1 can come from the Sith Library, but despite having Sith in the name, it does not actually have a faction. So to pay for the other resource, the dark side player will place a focus token on their faction card. Interrogation allows them to peek at the light side player's hand and force them to discard 1 card. Lucky them, they were able to force them to discard Luke Skywalker before he even hit the battlefield. Interrogation, like most events, can be played outside of the deployment phase. In this case, whenever the player has an available action window. After an event is resolved, it's then discarded. The other major card type you can play is units, which represents heroes and villains, starships and droids, creatures and monsters that you can recruit to your cause in the Galactic Civil War. The dark side player doesn't want to leave themselves undefended, so they'll pay 2 resources to put out a dark side apprentice. Note that Heart of the Empire can produce up to 3 resources at once. However, since there is already a focus token placed on it, it cannot be used again this turn, but it will be free to spend its full value next turn if the dark side player sees fit. The fifth phase is the conflict phase. However, the dark side player skips their first conflict phase. So let's fast forward to the light side player's turn, where they've played Yoda and Twi'lek Loyalist, and they declare Yoda as an attacker against Heart of the Empire. After a targeted objective and its attackers are declared, the opposing player may declare any ready units, those without focus tokens on them, as defenders. In this case, the dark side player sends the dark side apprentice to try and protect their capital planet, and thus begins an edge battle. Starting with the attacking player, each player may place one card from their hand face down into their edge stack, alternating between players until both decide to pass consecutively, at which point players will flip and reveal their edge stacks. When this happens, the first thing you do is resolve any fate cards. Fate cards exist solely to go into your edge stack and give special effects when they're used there. You resolve them from lowest number to highest, so the dark side player's Heat of Battle will resolve before target of opportunity. This will allow them to immediately place 1 damage onto Yoda. After that, the light side player's target of opportunity has a speed of 9. It allows them to place 1 damage on Heart of the Empire. We then look at the total number of force icons in each stack and compare them. In this case, both players are tied at 3. In the case of such ties, the defender wins, giving them the edge in battle. After the edge is determined, all cards used in edge stacks go to their discard piles. Gaining the edge in battle comes with 2 benefits. Firstly, only the player with the edge may activate their unit's white combat icons. Secondly, they get to strike first. Seeing that Yoda will otherwise be destroyed since he only has 2 damage capacity, shown in the lower left corner of all units and objectives, the light side player decides to play our most desperate hour. This will allow them to place a shield token onto Yoda. Since the dark side player only has 1 ready unit defending, they must focus it to strike. If they had multiple units, they'd be able to choose any of them to strike first. In this case, the dark side apprentice has 1 unit damage and 1 blast damage icon. Unit damage allows them to select 1 enemy unit in the engagement and deal damage equal to the number of icons. In this case, since Yoda is the only valid target, the shield will be destroyed, but he'll be protected. There's also a blast damage icon, but these are not used when defending. When attacking, blast damage would deal damage to the engaged objective. When the dark side apprentice focuses to strike, they'll take 2 focus tokens since they're currently committed to the force. More on that in a moment. After that, the light side player gets to choose a unit to retaliate. In this case, Yoda is the only option, since their loyalist is not in this engagement. They'll place a focus token on Yoda and have 1 black tactics icon. This allows them to choose any enemy unit, even one not in the engagement, and place a focus token on them. Since there's only 1 enemy unit right now, it'll go on to the dark side apprentice. If the light side player had won the edge, they'd also be able to use Yoda's other 2 icons. The blast damage icon would have dealt 1 damage to Heart of the Empire, and the unit damage would have dealt 1 damage to the dark side apprentice. Players will alternate focusing units to strike until all units in the engagement have at least 1 focus token on them. At that point, if at least 1 attacker survives and no defenders are present, then the attacking player will deal 1 bonus unopposed damage to the objective, even if no other damage was dealt to it in the engagement. Players may declare multiple engagements during their conflict phase if they have other units ready to attack. However, each objective may only be engaged once. The final phase of each turn is the Force phase. At this point, the active player may commit units to the Force. They begin the game with 3 commitment cards. Once committed, a unit cannot be removed from the Force until they're destroyed unless a card specifically says to do so. In this case, the light side player decides to commit their loyalist to the Force. After the active player decides whether or not to commit any units, players will count up the Force icons on their units that are both ready and committed. Last turn, the dark side player committed their dark side apprentice in order to take the balance of the Force with 1 point. This turn, the light side player has 1 point with their Twi'lek loyalist. The apprentice is still in play and committed, however, they're currently exhausted because they have at least 1 focus token on them. If the apprentice was also ready, then they would be tied at 1 each, in which case the balance would remain with whichever side it was already with. Since the light side player has 1 to the dark side player's 0, they'll retake the balance to finish up their turn. The game will continue like this until either the light side player is won by destroying 3 dark side objectives, or the dark side player is won by getting the Death Star dial up to 12. There are a lot of smaller rules that I didn't go over here, but this will give you a general gist of how to play. Of course, one of the most interesting things about these sort of games is that you can build your own decks. The Star Wars LCG does things very differently by having objective sets, which consist of 6 cards. 5 main cards that will go into your command deck, and then 1 objective card which will go into its own deck. This makes entry into deck building a simpler task as you only need to choose 10 objectives to start playing. But it doesn't do anything to harm high-end competitive play, as you're always having to weigh whether or not the strong cards in a set are worth it when you have to take along the weaker ones as well. Most sets would allow you to freely take 2 copies into a deck. However, some were limited to 1 per deck, and some required you to play as the matching faction in order to bring them along. Over the course of the game, it had a myriad of expansions released. There were 5 deluxe expansions, beginning with Edge of Darkness, which rounded out the core set by providing the cards needed for the light side to play as smugglers and spies, and the dark side to play as scum and villainy. Next up was Balance of the Force, which introduced multiplayer modes. This set included rules for playing 2v2, as well as including a set for each faction that encouraged team play. It also included a pair of challenge decks, which were overpowered and meant to be used in 2v1 or 3v1 games. After that came Between the Shadows, Imperial Entanglements, and Galactic Ambitions, each of which focused on a single light side and a single dark side faction. A lot of the sets in these 3 expansions in particular encouraged single faction play. Along the way, Fantasy Flight also released 36 smaller expansions known as Force Packs. These were divided into cycles of 6 packs each, which shared a common theme. First was Hoth, which had a lot of cards that focused on the namesake battle, including many which would gain bonuses if a player controlled a certain number of Hoth objectives. Second was Echoes of the Force, which included a number of ways to manipulate the Force struggle, and also introduced resource-producing cards which rewarded players for doing so. Next was the Rogue Squadron cycle, which introduced pilot cards, characters that could be played regularly as units, or could be played as enhancements on vehicles, often at a reduced cost. After that was the Endor cycle, which, much like Hoth, focused on its namesake battle. It also introduced missions, which could be played and then attacked as enemy objectives. Once they were destroyed, they'd give a bonus to the player that fulfilled it. Next up was the Opposition cycle, which included a set for each faction that specifically counteracted their opposing faction. So the Sith set was made to counter Jedi, the Rebel set was made to counteract the Imperials, etc. Also of particular note is that this cycle ended by including a fully playable Death Star card, the highest cost card in the entire game. Finally, the Alliances cycle encouraged mixed faction play. The most notable way it did this was through the use of 12 alternate faction cards, which restricted how you could build your deck, but gave you added bonuses for doing so. In addition to all that, it's hard not to appreciate just how much fan service is in this game. Firstly, you have every major character from the original trilogy, and since there are no blind buys, you didn't have to dig around for rares. Everyone you see on the front cover is actually in the core set. And beyond that, you had a lot of characters from the EU as well. For non-Star Wars aficionados, that's Expanded Universe, not European Union. Fans of the novels and video games will see a number of characters they'll recognize, such as Grand Admiral Thrawn, Kyle Katarn, Tycho Kelchu, and Mara Jade, just to name a few fan favorites. Although the game did run into Disney's acquisition of the franchise, even after characters from the new canon started showing up, they still paid homage to the original continuity, with the likes of AT-88 appearing alongside Ezra Bridger in the game's final pack. There's so much I could go into here that it's hard to know just where to stop. The Star Wars LCG is a remarkable game that fixed a lot of problems that I have with the dueling card game genre. Since there were no blind buys, players always had an even playing field even as the meta continually shifted. Beyond that, you no longer had to dig through hundreds or thousands of dollars worth of booster packs in order to complete your collection. And you could bring most of your favorite characters into play right out of the box. Being able to draw up to your hand size each turn gave you a lot more control over your decks than these sort of games usually have. This makes the game much less reliant on top decking than games like Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh, where that often cheapens the experience. And the edge battles always kept things tense, ensuring that players had a way to dump weaker cards and giving them alternative options for stronger ones. When people ask me what my favorite board game is, I always give 2 answers: Sentinels of the Multiverse or Star Wars the card game, which I find to be worthy of no less than an astounding 9.9 out of 10. You have no idea how heavy this thing is. Although the Star Wars LCG is no longer in production, you can still find most sets fairly cheaply, with the exception of a few especially sought after ones. If you're interested in learning more, links are included in the description. But what about you? What do you think of the Star Wars LCG? What's your favorite Star Wars tabletop game? If you have any questions, remarks, or opposing points of view, leave them in the comments down below. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, and ring that bell. Until next time, farewell, fellow fanatics. Thank you again for watching. I have plenty more to share with you if you're interested. You can click up here above my head to subscribe to my channel. You can click over here on my monitor to see the most recent video that I've worked on. Or if you prefer, you can click up here to open this mysterious vault and see what video that the YouTube algorithm has picked just for you.